Long before Rome became an empire, it was a city shaped by limits. Its earliest inhabitants lived within a narrow world defined by the Tiber River, the surrounding hills, and the seasonal rhythms of central Italy. Daily life moved at the pace of agriculture. Most people rose with the sun, worked small plots of land, tended animals, or practiced simple trades. Time was measured less by clocks than by planting cycles, market days, and religious festivals tied to nature. Early Rome was not yet the marble city later writers described. Houses were modest, built from wood, mud brick, and thatch. Streets were narrow and uneven, often muddy in winter and dusty in summer. Smoke from hearth fires lingered in the air. Clean water was scarce outside a few natural springs, and waste flowed openly through shallow channels. Disease was common, and life expectancy was low by modern standards. Social structure was rigid but still evolving. A small group of elite families controlled most land and political power, while the majority lived as farmers, laborers, or dependents tied to wealthier households. Patronage shaped nearly every relationship. Protection and opportunity flowed downward. Loyalty and service flowed upward. Citizenship existed, but it did not yet carry the universal meaning it would later acquire. Rights were uneven, and many residents had little voice in decisions that shaped their lives. Religion ordered much of this world. People believed divine forces were present in fields, doorways, and crossroads. Rituals were practical rather than philosophical, focused on maintaining balance with unseen powers. Before major decisions, priests read signs in the flight of birds or the entrails of animals. These practices did not slow life, they structured it. Few questioned whether the gods governed human success. Misfortune was often understood as ritual failure rather than chance. Rome's early economy was limited. Trade existed but remained local, relying on river transport and nearby roads. Most goods were produced for immediate use rather than distant markets. Coinage appeared late, and barter remained common. Wealth was measured in land and livestock more than money. This kept society relatively small-scale and personal, but also constrained growth. Politically, Rome balanced between monarchy, aristocratic rule, and popular participation. Power was shared and contested, not yet concentrated. Institutions existed to prevent any one figure from dominating, reflecting a deep fear of kingship rooted in early experience. This caution slowed decision-making but preserved internal stability for a time. Historians often describe this period as simple, but simplicity should not be mistaken for ease. Survival required constant effort. Food shortages, flooding, and conflict with neighboring communities were recurring threats. Violence was familiar, though usually limited in scale. War, when it occurred, was seasonal and close to home. What defined this early Roman world most clearly was its sense of proportion. People expected their lives to resemble those of their parents. Expansion was not inevitable, and greatness was not assumed. Rome was one community among many in Italy, shaped by constraints rather than ambition. Yet even in this restrained world, tensions existed. Population growth pressed against limited land. Competition among elites intensified. Contact with neighboring cultures introduced new goods and ideas that unsettled old habits. Few at the time could have predicted how these pressures would combine. For the moment, Rome remained grounded, cautious, and bounded. Its people lived within known horizons, unaware that the balance sustaining their world was already beginning to strain. The old balance that had shaped Rome's early life did not collapse all at once. It fractured gradually, under pressures that at first seemed manageable. Population growth strained farmland, while competition among elite families intensified political conflict. Small wars with neighboring communities became more frequent, and success in these conflicts began to change expectations. Victory brought land, captives, and prestige. For the first time, expansion appeared not only possible, but profitable. A critical rupture came as Rome moved beyond defensive warfare. Campaigns were no longer fought only to protect territory but to secure advantage. Conquered land was redistributed, often unevenly, rewarding those with influence. Captives were sold or forced into labor, increasing the presence of enslaved people in Roman society. This shift altered the economy in subtle but lasting ways. Large estates began to replace small farms, worked by people who had no stake in the land they cultivated. Political institutions struggled to adapt. Officers designed to govern a city-state were now tasked with managing distant territories and extended campaigns. Power flowed increasingly toward generals who commanded armies for long periods. Soldiers became more loyal to their commanders than to abstract institutions. This loyalty was not ideological, it was practical. Generals provided pay, land, and protection after service ended. One widely accepted fact is that Rome's military success reshaped its political culture. Yet historians still debate whether this transformation was deliberate or accidental. Some argue Rome stumbled into empire through repeated short-term decisions. Others see a pattern of calculated expansion masked by traditional language of defense and honor. What is clear is that each victory made the next conflict easier to justify. Contact with the wider Mediterranean accelerated change. As Rome encountered wealthier, more urbanized societies, expectations shifted. Foreign luxuries entered the city. New tastes in food, clothing, and architecture appeared. Older Romans often viewed these changes with suspicion, fearing moral decline. Laws were passed to limit excess, suggesting anxiety rather than confidence. The consequences reached ordinary people. Small farmers, drawn into long campaigns, returned to find their land neglected or claimed by creditors. Many drifted to the city, swelling Rome's population. Urban life offered opportunity but little security. Crowded housing, irregular work, and dependence on grain distributions became common. The rhythm of life changed from seasonal to unpredictable. Religion adapted rather than resisted. New gods were absorbed alongside old ones, reflecting Rome's practical approach to belief. Victory itself became sacred, celebrated through triumphs that displayed foreign spoils and captives. These ceremonies reinforced the idea that expansion was divinely favored, even inevitable. Few Romans at the time fully grasped the scale of what was unfolding. Each war seemed discrete, each reform temporary. Yet together they marked a break from the restrained world that had existed before. Rome was no longer merely responding to threats. It was reshaping its surroundings, and in doing so, reshaping itself. The old limits, geographic, political, and moral, were weakening. In their place emerged a new reality defined by momentum. Once movement outward began, stopping became increasingly difficult. The city had crossed a threshold, and there would be no return to the earlier balance that had once defined Roman life. Rome's transformation did not begin everywhere at once, nor could it have begun just anywhere. Geography played a quiet but decisive role. The city sat inland, protected from sudden naval attack, yet connected to the sea by the Tiber River. This position allowed Rome to trade without being fully exposed, to grow without becoming dependent on maritime power. The surrounding plains supported agriculture, while nearby hills offered natural defense. Rome was neither isolated nor easily overrun. Italy itself encouraged expansion. Unlike regions dominated by a single strong power, the peninsula was divided among many communities with similar military capacities. No rival was overwhelming, but none were negligible. This created a competitive environment where survival depended on alliances, adaptability, and repeated conflict. Rome learned early how to absorb defeated enemies rather than simply destroy them. Former rivals could become allies, soldiers, or citizens, expanding Rome's manpower with each victory. Institutions mattered as much as terrain. Rome developed a system of governance that distributed authority across multiple offices, limiting individual dominance while maintaining continuity. This structure reduced the risk of collapse during crises. Even when leaders failed, the system endured. Magistrates rotated regularly, and collective decision-making slowed reckless action while preserving legitimacy. Historians still debate whether this balance was intentional design or the product of gradual adjustment. One lesser-known tension lay in Rome's legal culture. Laws were public and written, a departure from many neighboring societies where custom ruled. This transparency allowed disputes to be managed without constant violence, at least within the citizen body. It also created a shared framework that could be extended to new populations. Law became a tool of integration as much as control. Economic flexibility reinforced political strength. Rome did not rely on a single export or trade route. Its economy blended agriculture, craftsmanship, and later, long-distance trade. This diversity reduced vulnerability. When one sector suffered, others compensated. Wealth flowed unevenly, but the system itself proved resilient. Cultural attitudes also mattered. Romans valued discipline, endurance, and collective identity. Personal ambition was expected, even admired, but framed as service to the community. Public honor depended on visible contribution, especially military success. This encouraged elite competition that benefited the state, at least in the short term. Yet it also planted the seeds of future conflict, as ambition increasingly outpaced institutional restraint. Rome's openness to foreign practices set it apart. Conquered peoples brought skills, technologies, and beliefs that Rome adopted selectively. Rather than weakening Roman identity, this adaptability strengthened it. Still, some contemporaries feared that borrowing too much would erode traditional values. Whether Rome's success came from cultural flexibility or despite it remains a subject of debate. What began here was not inevitable. Geography offered opportunity, not destiny. Institutions provided tools, not guarantees. Rome's rise depended on how these elements interacted over time, shaped by human choices made under pressure. Few participants could see the full pattern. They acted within familiar frameworks, responding to immediate needs. Yet those responses accumulated. Rome expanded not because it was destined to rule, but because its location, systems, and ideas made expansion sustainable once it began. As Rome's reach extended, its growth depended less on individual victories and more on systems that could operate at scale. Technology, in the Roman sense, was practical rather than inventive. Few devices were entirely new. What distinguished Rome was its ability to organize, standardize, and deploy tools across vast distances. This capacity turned expansion into permanence. Roads formed the backbone of this system. Built for durability rather than speed, Roman roads connected cities, forts, and ports with remarkable consistency. Stone foundations, careful drainage, and standardized widths allowed armies and information to move reliably in all seasons. A messenger could travel farther and faster under Roman rule than in most earlier societies. Control followed movement. Water management revealed similar thinking. Aqueducts carried fresh water from distant sources into growing cities, supporting populations far larger than local springs could sustain. Public fountains, baths, and latrines reshaped urban life. Clean water improved health, but it also reinforced social order. Access was public, yet uneven, reflecting broader inequalities. Still, few cities in the ancient world matched this scale of infrastructure. Administrative systems accelerated expansion as much as engineering. Census-taking allowed Rome to measure population, taxation, and military obligations. Written records tracked land, citizenship, and legal status. This bureaucracy reduced dependence on local custom and personal memory. Decisions could be enforced consistently across regions that had never seen Rome itself. The army became both a fighting force and a construction workforce. Soldiers built roads, bridges, and fortifications as part of their service. This blurred the line between military and civil labor. Camps often evolved into permanent settlements, anchoring Roman presence in newly conquered areas. Over time, these sites became cities, complete with forums, markets, and temples. One widely accepted fact is that Roman logistics enabled campaigns far from the city. Less discussed is the strain this placed on local populations. Supplying armies required grain, animals, and labor, often requisitioned with little compensation. While infrastructure brought long-term benefits, the short-term costs were heavy and unevenly distributed. Technology also shaped time. Standardized calendars, legal schedules, and official announcements synchronized life across regions. Festivals, tax deadlines, and military musters followed a shared rhythm. For the first time, distant communities experienced time in similar ways, linked to the center by administrative expectation. Historians debate whether this acceleration improved daily life for most people. Urban residents gained access to water, entertainment, and markets. Rural communities often faced heavier demands. Efficiency favored the state more than the individual. Yet participation in Roman systems offered stability compared to constant local warfare. These technologies did not merely support empire, they reshaped how people understood space and authority. Distance felt shorter. Power felt present even when unseen. Stone roads and flowing water made Rome tangible in places far from the city itself. What emerged was a world held together not by constant force, but by systems that made resistance difficult and integration practical. Expansion no longer relied on extraordinary effort. It became routine, embedded in the structures of everyday life. Beneath Rome's systems of order and efficiency lay lives shaped by obligation, risk, and uneven reward. Expansion created opportunity, but it also imposed costs that fell disproportionately on those with the least power. For many, Roman rule was experienced not through monuments or laws, but through labor, displacement, and uncertainty. Enslaved people formed the foundation of much Roman economic life. Captured in war or born into bondage, they worked in households, fields, mines, and workshops. Some lived closely with their owners. Others labored in brutal conditions, especially in mining operations where survival rates were low. While Roman law recognized enslaved people as property, daily reality was more complex. Skilled individuals could manage businesses or educate children, yet remained legally vulnerable. Historians still debate whether this flexibility softened the institution or merely made it more efficient. Soldiers also bore heavy costs. Service promised land and status, but it demanded years of discipline and exposure to violence. Campaigns extended far from Italy, keeping men away from families for long periods. Injuries were common, and support after discharge was inconsistent. Loyalty to commanders often reflected practical dependence rather than ideological commitment. Urban life offered no refuge from hardship. Rome's population swelled as rural residents migrated in search of work. Most lived in crowded apartment buildings prone to fire and collapse. Rent consumed much of their income. Employment was irregular, tied to construction projects, trade cycles, or state distributions of grain. The city fed its people, but only just enough to prevent unrest. Environmental strain accompanied growth. Forests were cleared for fuel and construction. Mining scarred landscapes and polluted water sources. Soil exhaustion followed intensive farming. These changes were rarely questioned at the time, as abundance in one region masked depletion in another. Few recognized the long-term consequences. Conquered communities experienced Roman rule as both stability and loss. Local elites often retained influence by cooperating, while others saw traditions eroded. Taxes and requisitions altered local economies. Roads connected regions, but they also facilitated extraction. Resistance occurred, sometimes violently, but was usually short-lived. Over time, accommodation replaced opposition. Women's experiences varied widely. Elite women gained visibility and influence within households, while working women labored in markets, workshops, and domestic service. Legal limitations remained strict, yet daily practice allowed negotiation. These ambiguities reveal tensions between ideology and reality within Roman society. Rome's grandeur rested on these human costs. The empire functioned because many accepted hardship as normal, inevitable, or temporary. Whether this acceptance reflected resignation or resilience remains debated. What is clear is that expansion was not a shared triumph. The systems that connected the empire also transmitted inequality. Order was maintained, but at a price paid unevenly. For many, Roman peace meant predictability rather than prosperity. Life continued, endured rather than celebrated, within the shadow of a vast and demanding state. Over time, Rome's reach produced a world increasingly connected by shared systems, even as local differences endured. Cities multiplied across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, often modeled on Roman layouts. Forums, baths, and amphitheaters became familiar features, symbols of participation in a wider order. Urban life followed patterns recognizable far from Rome itself. Economic integration deepened these connections. Goods moved along roads and sea routes with growing regularity. Grain from North Africa fed distant cities. Metals from Spain supplied tools and weapons. Pottery, glass, and textiles circulated widely. This exchange supported specialization, allowing regions to focus on what they produced best. Wealth accumulated, though unevenly, creating new social distinctions. A new class of administrators, merchants, and professionals emerged. These people owed their status not to ancestry alone, but to service within Roman systems. Citizenship expanded gradually, extending legal identity beyond the city of Rome. For some, this brought security and opportunity. For others, it remained symbolic, offering obligations more than benefits. Infrastructure reshaped daily experience. Public baths served as social centers where people of different backgrounds mingled. Standardized measures and coinage simplified trade. Legal procedures became more predictable, reducing arbitrary violence within the system's bounds. Yet access to these benefits varied. Rural areas often lagged behind cities, reinforcing divides. Cultural exchange flowed in multiple directions. Local traditions persisted, adapting rather than disappearing. Roman gods merged with regional deities. Languages blended, producing new dialects. Art and architecture reflected both local materials and imperial styles. This hybridity challenges the idea of a uniform Roman culture. Historians still debate whether integration created genuine shared identity or merely a surface-level conformity. The military remained present, but its role shifted. Garrisons stabilized borders and enforced order, allowing civilian life to expand. Over time, soldiers settled locally, marrying and raising families. The distinction between conqueror and resident blurred. This gradual normalization of Roman presence reduced the visibility of domination, even as control remained firm. Infrastructure also facilitated ideas. News, fashions, and beliefs traveled faster than before. Religious movements spread along trade routes, sometimes challenging traditional practices. The empire provided the channels through which alternatives circulated. Few authorities anticipated how these networks might one day undermine established norms. This interconnected world was resilient but not static. Prosperity depended on constant movement of goods and resources. Disruption in one region could ripple outward. Stability required maintenance, coordination, and trust in distant systems. For many, life within this transformed world felt ordinary. Children grew up knowing only Roman order. The scale of change faded into background routine. Yet the very normality of this world marked a profound shift. Never before had so many lived within a single, continuous framework of governance and exchange. When Rome's power eventually fragmented, its presence did not simply vanish. Roads continued to guide movement long after legions withdrew. Cities persisted, shrinking or changing function but rarely disappearing altogether. Legal concepts, administrative habits, and cultural expectations endured, carried forward by those who had lived within Roman systems and adapted them to new circumstances. One widely accepted fact is that Roman law influenced later legal traditions across Europe. Ideas of citizenship, contracts, and public authority survived in altered form. Yet historians debate how direct this influence truly was. Some argue later societies consciously preserved Roman models. Others suggest continuity emerged less from preservation than from the practical usefulness of inherited structures. Language offers another example of Rome's imprint. Latin evolved into multiple regional forms, becoming the foundation for new languages. This linguistic legacy shaped communication, education, and identity for centuries. At the same time, many local languages persisted, reminding us that Roman influence led itself over existing cultures rather than erasing them. Infrastructure left perhaps the most visible traces. Bridges, aqueducts, and roads continued to serve communities long after imperial administration ended. Their durability set expectations about what public works could achieve. Few realized when they were built that these structures would outlast the political order that created them. Social hierarchies also lingered. Patterns of land ownership, urban privilege, and rural dependency did not disappear with imperial authority. Inequality, once embedded in Roman systems, proved difficult to dismantle. Whether Rome created these divisions or merely amplified existing ones remains a subject of debate. Rome's legacy is not only material or institutional. It shaped how later societies understood power itself. The idea that authority could extend over vast territories through law, infrastructure, and shared norms became a model others sought to emulate. At the same time, Rome's eventual decline served as a warning about overextension, dependence on complex systems, and internal tension. For modern observers, Rome invites reflection rather than judgment. Its achievements were real, its costs substantial. Order and exploitation coexisted. Innovation relied on adaptation rather than invention. Few people living within the empire could see the whole picture, just as few today can fully perceive the systems that shape their own lives. The world Rome created did not end cleanly. It dissolved unevenly, leaving fragments that continued to shape daily life. In that sense, Rome remains present not as a place or a power, but as a pattern, one that still influences how societies organize space, authority, and belonging.